Hello, protocols, packets, and programs. This March, let's avoid the madness of InfoSec myths, misconceptions, and mistakes. Let's update our threat models. Let's pay attention to modern designs. Let's spend less time enumerating common vulns and more time eradicating vuln classes. Let's use public Wi-Fi with our up-to-date devices. Which means this week we chat with Jack Cable about CISA's focus on secure by design, what goes into a good design, and the progress we hope to see from pledges. March 4th, and stay tuned for Application Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network.
It's the show to learn the latest tools and techniques to understand DevOps, applications, and the cloud. Your trusted source for the latest Appsec news. It's time for Application Security Weekly. This is episode 321, recorded March 10th, 2025. I'm your host, Mike Shima, and I'm here with someone new, Jackie McGuire. Hello, Jackie.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for having me. Happy to be able to jump the wall from Enterprise Security Weekly.
Exactly. We've got a containment breach, but I think in the best of ways. So happy to have you here. We have also Jack. Jack Cable is a hacker who works at the intersection of cybersecurity and public policy, currently the CEO and co-founder of Corridor. Prior to that, Jack served as a senior technical advisor at CISA, where he helped lead the agency's Secure by Design initiative. Before CISA, Jack worked as a Tech Congress Fellow for the Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee, advising Chairman Gary Peters on cybersecurity policy. Everything in the government's a mouthful for me to get out here. He previously worked as a security architect at Krebs Stamos Group. He worked at the Pentagon's Defense Digital Service after placing first in the Hack the Air Force Bug Bounty Challenge. Jack, hello. Thank you for joining us.
Hello. Thanks so much for having me.
So, you hacked the Air Force. We got to ask, what was your favorite bug out of that bug bounty? Was it SR-71? Was it something geeky? Let us know.
So yeah, great question. Let me think back. And this was, so when I was in high school, I got into doing a bunch of bug bounty programs. As a sophomore, I got my first, or maybe a junior, got my first invite to the Hack the Pentagon program. So I got an email from HackerOne saying, what if I told you the Pentagon wanted you to hack it? And there I was I think I was 16, and I was like, why would they want me out of all the people? But I did the first one, didn't do very well, but kind of got motivated then to try harder for the next one, which was with the Air Force. For that one, if I remember correctly, wound up finding over 40 vulnerabilities in various Air Force networks. I think the worst one, or the best, depending on kind of which perspective you have, was a remote code execution vulnerability in one of the Air Force's web servers. So that was a super great experience to be able to see, okay, even as a teenager, I was able to be helping the Pentagon to secure their systems, and just goes to show that even, those who you think are secure always have more room for improvement.
Seriously, I love that you're doing this in high school. You're keeping, the spirit of Matthew Broderick alive. So probably you didn't have any dial-up modems, but or tab product placement in the background. But we'll work on that in post. Indeed, but Jack, we asked you here today because perhaps related to those bug bounties, software has a couple holes in it. It hasn't been secure. Already, to set this up a little bit, we're in March 2025. There's been a few hundred, maybe even several hundred CVEs for cross-site scripting and SQL injection alone. CISA has been talking about secure by design. When are we going to have a secure by design? Where maybe I won't ask you the hard questions first. Tell us what actually is secure by design. What was CISA pushing for the last few years?
Definitely. And so I was at CISA, Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, for just about 2 years, left around 2 months ago. But really my focus while there, as you mentioned, was leading on the Secure by Design initiative. And this really is the idea that if you look out there at vulnerabilities being exploited today, if you look at CISA's known exploit vulnerabilities catalog, for instance, the classes of vulnerabilities are things that we've known about for decades, but not only that we've known how, in far too many cases, to prevent them at scale for decades. So you mentioned SQL injections, cross-site scripting, where these are both, I don't even know when the first SQL injection vulnerability was documented, certainly over probably at least 25 years ago. And just a data point there, MySQL introduced parameterized queries in 2004, and those allow preventing SQL injection vulnerabilities essentially off the bat. And yet here we are in 2025, 21 years later, and seemingly we still struggle with these common classes of vulnerabilities. So CISA's approach to secure by design, this was really started in 2023, was to first recognize that we have a problem, that we can do better. And we put out guidance on really approaching this from the business perspective, recognizing that people have been talking about essentially secure by design for a while. It isn't necessarily anything new technically to say we should design systems to be more resilient to common classes of vulnerabilities. But I think really what is different is, one, the level of emphasis, where you have CISA and 13 other countries saying this is the highest priority. You have, for instance, the White House's National Cybersecurity Strategy that came out in 2023, arguing for secure by design as well, and advocating to business executives, so from the CEO down at software companies, that security and product security specifically should be a top priority. So that's really where I think we now have both the technical advancements combined with some of the business buy-in to start to see some of these changes being possible.
And that's what I'm curious too about, this slight change in approach or change in focus of perhaps the audience or the thrust of the secure design, and why those choices instead of just blaming the user more, since that wasn't the choice you took. But you mentioned getting business incentives, and there's a easy cliche about developers don't care about security, or there's an easy cliche of Appsec is a cost center. How did you frame that? What were you and the group doing to think of to engage businesses in a different way from these past 2 decades of how Appsec has been doing it?
Yep. So I think first, this really requires a shift in approach in terms of how people think about security. And as you mentioned, kind of the go-to approach has been to blame the users. It's always the person who clicked the phishing link, or the person who forgot to apply to patch, or the intern who set the password to 123. And it's never the underlying software products that enabled the vulnerabilities that were there in the first place that led to these other kind of accidents being able to happen. Similar to how, for instance, we made a lot of reference to the automobile industry, and it was prevailing wisdom 60, 70 years ago that crashes were due to bad drivers and that they should just be better. And there wasn't anything possible that car manufacturers could have done to make cars safer. Now, of course, we know today that's not true. We know we can have seat belts. We know we can have airbags. We know we can have all of these safety features that really can be built into cars. And similarly, we also know now with software products that there's ways to do this safer. We can have software products that enable multi-factor authentication by default, so that's not on users to turn that on, and ideally phishing-resistant MFA. We can have software products that use parameterized queries, that use web template frameworks to prevent cross-site scripting vulnerabilities, and so on. So a lot of the kind of approaches we took were thinking, okay, not kind of how can we blame customer organizations, who, by the way, are significantly less resourced, less capable. If you think about hospitals, school systems, small businesses, you name it, really, they don't have the resources to go up to bat against either cyber criminals or nation state attackers. So how can we begin to shift some of that burden onto software manufacturers who are best able to prevent these vulnerabilities from the start?
And that last part too really is, I wanted to highlight, because I think it's a distinction between, we've known this was easy to prevent, call it cross-site scripting, SQL injection, etc. But that's not the same as saying this is easy to implement and easy to deploy, especially that a hospital, I think it's safe to guess, does not have the same size or budget of a security team of Google.
Yep.
So, how do you have this conversation with a business that isn't Google?
Yep. So, and certainly and Google, for instance, has done a lot of good work in terms of rooting out classes of vulnerabilities like SQL injections and cross-site scripting. And they've been able to do that by making it hard for developers to do the wrong thing, right? So they'll have invariants in place where you must use this library to run your database queries. You must use this front-end framework to display content to an end user. And as a result, it's going to be significantly harder to introduce a vulnerability. Okay, that's Google. No one or very few have the same resources as that. So what's everyone else going to do? And I think that there's a few positives. I'd say one, there's many more readily available frameworks, libraries that one, developers want to use, and two, are more secure by default. So if we think about cross-site scripting, where the status quo, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago was to use something like jQuery, you're directly manipulating the DOM, you're directly interacting with HTML, super easy to mess up, super easy to introduce a cross-site scripting vulnerability, versus now pretty much every developer is using React, not because it's more secure, but because it makes development easier. They don't have to fiddle with modifying HTML. They can just say, okay, here's what I want, here's where the user input should be, and React handles the rest. So it's easier from a developer experience, but it also happens to be more secure. It's super hard to mess up security when it comes to React. You have to literally invoke a function called dangerously set inner HTML. So at the very minimum, you should know you're doing something bad. But all this is to say that I think the resources are there to build products that are more secure by design. And we can dive into this more. I think the reasons companies still struggle is, one, due to existing large-scale legacy code bases. It's not easy to grapple with retrofitting your code to be more secure when you have millions or tens of millions, hundreds of millions of lines of code that are essentially technical debt. So I think that's one reason. And two, I think there still is some aspect of those at the kind of very front can be adopting some of these approaches to root out classes of vulnerabilities, but others still have a lot of catching up to do.
I want to kind of bring it back to your comment about seatbelt laws, because I think that's actually a really good parallel for where we're at right now with a new administration kind of focused on deregulation. Because when the Reagan administration came in, they actually overturned seatbelt laws. So a lot of seatbelt laws had been passed across the US, and they were in favor of deregulation and leaving it to the states to decide. So, the Reagan administration did away with seatbelt laws, and it was actually insurance companies that sued the administration to get seatbelt laws put back in place because they had a vested business interest in doing so. So I kind of want to get your take on, if we look forward to the next couple years and there's less focus on regulation at the software level, because it seems like the new administration, the new CISA, is kind of more focused on securing physical infrastructure and hardware. Do we see insurance companies, cyber risk insurance companies, playing a meaningful role in getting to secure by design the way they did in establishing seatbelt laws? Because with losses mounting from the last several years, I'm just wondering your perspective on, how we as a private sector kind of come together to create this expectation of secure by design, absent regulation. And if you think insurance companies play a role in that, because I'm increasingly seeing cyber risk insurance companies involved in areas of security and development that they normally would not be, as they spot where their risk is coming from.
Yep. So I think the good news is that we've seen tremendous, really bipartisan support around secure by design, where this isn't, I don't think it's something that's going to start and end with a certain administration, but I do view it as something that will be a long-lasting priority. And if you look, for instance, there was a hearing in the House Homeland Security Committee back in December around secure by design. A number of private sector witnesses were testifying. All were quite favorable of secure by design, but you also had members from both sides acknowledging how important secure by design is. And I think the reason for this is that really that this isn't anything super partisan, but people can recognize, okay, one, given the threat landscape we're in, particularly given the current threats we're seeing from the People's Republic of China, Volt Typhoon, Salt Typhoon, etc., which all too often are exploiting vulnerabilities in software products. So there's a clear reason to do better. And it's also the fact I was getting back to, okay, who's kind of currently today bearing the burden of insecure software? It's small businesses, it's critical infrastructure owners and operators, it's everyone else. And by realigning some of those incentives, by shifting some of that burden, I think that there's a lot of potential for software companies really to step up and ensure better outcomes for everyone. So I would expect there to continue to be support to build on top of the work we did at CISA, which by the way, CISA is a voluntary agency. The work we did, while it wasn't just say, reaffirming what tech companies were doing. We were definitely pushing them to do better, but it was voluntary. We organized a pledge, for instance, where companies committed to taking actions. That was a voluntary pledge, and yet close to 300 companies have now stepped up and said, I commit to doing better, and I'm going to demonstrate how I'm doing that.
And I think the pledge is a great follow-up from Jackie's question, because a lot of time in the C in cybersecurity tends to stand for cynicism. And so, CISA here is not an enforcement agency, and talking about a pledge and, in the spirit of also Jackie's question, we're coming up on, RSA is coming shortly, coming up on the 1 year of that pledge. What do you hope to see as the progress on those pledges so that companies are actually doing more than just saying we take your security seriously, but doing that show, don't tell?
Yep. So and for context, we started this Secure by Design pledge, right? Launched it, as you mentioned, back in May of last year. And the way it's structured is that there's 7 goals that companies have committed to. This includes things like increasing the use of multi-factor authentication, reducing entire classes of vulnerabilities, reducing default passwords, and so on, having a vulnerability disclosure policy, filing CVE records with the common weakness enumeration identifier, CWE, included. So it's taking these actions, but really the key part is companies didn't just commit to doing these, they committed to talking about what they've done, and really demonstrating measurable progress. So when we looked at the pledge, I mentioned there were 68 companies when it first launched. This includes some of the really ranging from startups to the world's largest companies, period, including Google, Microsoft, Amazon Web Services, Cisco, IBM, and many others. So by committing to demonstrating measurable progress, really the goal there is, as you mentioned, it's a voluntary pledge. This isn't a law enforcement agency. There's not going to be legal action for companies not complying with it. That's not the goal. The goal is to set up an approach where companies can really begin to differentiate themselves on the basis of what they're doing from a perspective of security. So my hope for RSA this year by May 8th, which is the 1 year anniversary, is that every company who, at least in the initial batch, since it was done on a rolling basis, the first 68 companies who signed up on May 8th and took the pledge, that they will have a public report documenting what they've done. And when I was at CISA, we did set up a page linking to progress reports companies have put out. I'd say there's probably around 25 right now. And really from all the companies who've put out reports, it includes companies like Google, Microsoft, Fortinet, Sophos, a number of others. There's a lot of good stuff in there. I think companies who, at least the ones who've documented their work, are making actual efforts. They've certainly done things differently, I would say, since signing the pledge. And I think good signals we're seeing, for instance, after the pledge, we now have all of the three major cloud manufacturers, Google, Amazon, Microsoft, are now shifting towards requiring multi-factor authentication for their users. So that alone, in my opinion, is a pretty big step, that we're getting that. And I think we're going to continue seeing some of these trends that I'd say were accelerated by the pledge.
Yeah, and that just moving to MFA is one of those things that seems simple, that I understand and will acknowledge quickly that it has problems or challenges to it, like account recovery, trust, etc. But it's still the smart thing to do. And that's one of the things I really liked about CISA Secured by Design was, I slightly paraphrasing, taking ownership of customer outcomes. Are there other outcomes you'd like to see? You know, if you could wave that magic wand and, you know, May 8th rolls around, we've got cloud service providers with MFA. Well, what's number 2 on your list there?
Yep. So there's a lot of things on that list, and I suppose all the pledge items would be great to see. Just to call out a few. One area is thinking about, okay, we need more transparency with CVEs because, and again, going back to the auto industry, there's databases that I believe it's I'm going to butcher the acronym, but the National Highway and Transit Safety Administration, something like that, that maintains a record of all the kind of auto incidents, accidents, and not just that, but kind of the causes, whether that's due to a kind of defect in the car, or what have you. Likewise for aviation, we have immense scrutiny there, and we track in lots of detail, especially as evidenced by some of the recent incidents we've had, where it's these incidents are viewed as anomalies. When they happen, there's robust investigations, really get to the bottom of what was the root cause to make sure that we don't have those again. And as a result, aviation is incredibly safe. The rates of accidents are quite remarkably low. Even auto safety has improved quite dramatically over the past century. And of course, while there's always room to improve, we're in a much better place there. And that's been enabled by the fact that we are able to understand the causes of the incidents, and car manufacturers, airplane manufacturers can address if there are defects and improve those. What do we have in cybersecurity? It's kind of hard to think of an analog. We have the CVE database.
SEC rule that is basically useless because they gutted most of the detailed reporting out of it right before they passed it.
So really we don't have a ton. And I think our best bet there, even while CVEs aren't analogous to incidents, we still get a lot of value from that. But one of the challenges today is, I'd say it's really twofold. One, we have inconsistent reporting of CVEs by software manufacturers. And two, we don't always have all the information we need. On that first bit, there's some norms around filing CVEs, it still is inconsistent, especially when it comes to things like software as a service products. That really is more of the Wild West, and I would love to see more companies move towards filing CVEs for vulnerabilities in their product, regardless of whether it's off-the-shelf software or software as a service. And we're seeing some good action there. Microsoft, for instance, has started publishing CVEs for their software as a service products. So seeing some good action there. And then number 2 really is the CWE field, common weakness enumeration, where getting back to this idea of knowing the root cause. What's the root cause of vulnerability? It's the vulnerability class, right? It's knowing that, okay, this was a SQL injection vulnerability, this was a cross-site scripting vulnerability, and then we know kind of how those can be addressed. But right now, that isn't a required field. It's inconsistently reported. So one of the things the pledge had is companies committing to including that. So I'd say those are 2 areas in which, if we can at the very least have a database of the vulnerabilities we've had and their root causes, then we can start to see how things are improving or not improving over time and go from there.
Do you think the hesitation is that all of a sudden people start drawing lines in that database and figure out that there's just a couple vendors that are extremely problematic? Like, I'm thinking about a large network security vendor that in the last 6 months has had multiple turns out to be undisclosed, critical security flaws. And so what do you think the hesitation is on the part of vendors on creating one of these databases? Is it the liability aspect?
So there's always some, I'd say, trepidation when it comes to vulnerability disclosure. And this is something where I've spent a lot of time, both in my time doing bug bounties, but then have also worked with various government entities, both Department of Defense, a number of states as well, to help them get into vulnerability disclosure, helped get all of the election equipment, so voting machine manufacturers helped them start vulnerability disclosure policies. So I've seen a lot around how companies initially can be very cautious when it comes to disclosing vulnerabilities, right? And that makes sense because there is a certain amount of, kind of an aspect of the unknown when it comes to being vulnerable, no pun intended. So I think this is an area where there might be some trepidation early on, but if we look at various industries, I'd say we continue to see a movement towards transparency, a movement towards being more comfortable with disclosing vulnerabilities, and recognition that transparency is beneficial for everyone. And I think there's an aspect too where we need to make sure that, of course, while it's not a positive sign when products have vulnerabilities, we should be glad that we at least know about those in the first place and that vendors are being transparent in disclosing those, because I think really the first step, again, to improving is recognizing that you have room to improve, and by being more transparent in, say, the vulnerabilities they've had, their root causes, we can all begin to do better.
Now, part of what this conversation has really been focused on was the companies that did the pledge, having business justification, or I should say business incentives, or pushing on the businesses to embrace, engage this type of secure by design approach. And there's an area, though, that I think you're familiar with, is let's bring open source into this, because who in the open source community would be signing a pledge? Is that the same thing we should be thinking of, as well as just that the classic problems in open source of getting funding, attention, who's helping? We can look at things just last year of the exautils is just a great example of that idea of trust.
Yep. So that's an area that I've spent a lot of time on, and I think it is super important and underappreciated. So I, when I was in the Senate, for instance, I wrote a bill called the Securing Open Source Software Act that hasn't quite become law yet, but it's got a lot of good bipartisan support. And that was right after Log4Shell, where a lot of people in various policy circles, you can imagine, were beginning to talk about open source, say, wait a second, we might want to think about this, and start to kind of surface some of the kind of questions that many in the open source community had been thinking about for decades. So I think that was a bit of a wake-up call, and really what I've tried to do is channel the kind of government's work into a positive direction. So both what the Securing Open Source Software Act would do, as well as what I then went to set up at CISA, was really focused on seeing how the US government, and particularly CISA, could be a more active player in the open source community, recognizing that it's not government's role to try to control or regulate open source. Quite the opposite. It's to show up as a community member and contribute, because in open source, people don't really care about who you are, kind of what organization that you're with. They care more about what you can contribute and how you can help advance the state of things. So really, that's how we tried to approach it at CISA. We put out an open source software security roadmap laying out the work that kind of we focus on. I'd say a couple main areas. One really was building out relationships with open source communities, we wanted to make sure that when the next Log4Shell happened, or XZ and so on, that we would be better prepared. And so we actually held a summit with probably around 50 open source community members. This was back in March of 2024, right before, as you might note, the XZ compromise came out. So one of the things we did there was we held a tabletop exercise with those community members focused on really testing response to an incident that wound up looking somewhat similar to XZ. So we got a lot of positive feedback that actually did help them prepare and make sure we had, for instance, the right communication channels in place so that when that did go down, we were able to react quickly, look for potentially similar compromises elsewhere, and so on. So that's one area, but there's a lot of other work we did, for instance, with the Open Source Security Foundation on securing package repositories, platforms like NPM or PyPI that all too often are under-resourced, but as you can imagine, are active targets for attackers. So seeing how we could work with these platforms to shore up their security. So really, I think a lot of positive areas where government can help improve security if approached the right way. So was glad to lead some of those early examples of positive collaboration.
The part of this is then, I think, a lot of this conversation is maybe implying that the Appsec community, the InfoSec, has been, these are known problems. We've been talking about these defenses. We've known these problems for a long time. It's now time for businesses to do something. I want to slightly invert that and say, well, maybe Appsec hasn't been effective for the last 2 decades. And it took engineering team to coming out of Meta to build React to actually have a framework that made a real difference, or Let's Encrypt to do something that made it easy to have and budget friendly to have certificates, so we can get to the world today of even having 6-day-old certs and rotating them quickly rather than having lists or things like that. Is there a particular call to action that you would also put here for the InfoSec community or Appsec people to contribute to actual secure by design that becomes reality?
Yep. So great question. I think that the biggest thing is that, kind of as you mentioned, I think kind of one of the observations is that while there have been some advancements in some places, it is still the case that a lot of organizations still struggle with it. And I think it's not because it's so technically challenging that you can never build an effective AppSec program, you can never root out classes of vulnerabilities. It's more that most organizations today are still kind of in this, let's call it whack-a-mole approach to AppSec, where it's okay, this really more of a reactive posture, right? Where you get a vulnerability report, or you assess or find something, you spend a lot of time digging through that and addressing that one vulnerability, but not kind of taking a step back, looking at the bigger picture and seeing how are you going to root out that vulnerability class as a whole. So I think there's a lot of good opportunity now, especially when we talk about, I think, some of the, say, positive applications of large language models, things like that, to help with refactoring code components to root out classes of vulnerabilities. So I think there's more promise than ever when it comes to being able to build an actually effective AppSec program. I'm working on kind of building out some of that with my new company, but I'd say to AppSec leaders, really, I'd say look to some of the best, look to how Google and many others have approached this, where they're really designing invariants into their products so that it's hard for developers to do the wrong thing, right? Just like we shouldn't be blaming users, we also shouldn't be blaming developers. While we should, for instance, expect, and one thing I've been advocating for is to better integrate security into computer science education, but we're a long ways from that. So for now, I think companies really ought to be focusing on making it hard for developers to do the wrong thing so that they can focus on feature development and really building out the product with security invariants in place. So that might look like defining, okay, essentially you can imagine your security style guide at a company. Here's how for these given classes of vulnerabilities, we address these. We use React for cross-site scripting. We use this kind of database wrapper for doing secure database queries and so on. So I think that's really a lot of what the role of a modern Appsec team should be, is focused on building some of these guardrails so that it is hard for developers to do the wrong thing.
I think it's really easy to lose sight of how young software is in general comparatively. Like we talk about the auto industry, and can you imagine if there were as many auto manufacturers as there are software manufacturers, in establishing those kind of standards and things like that. Vehicles have been around for 100 years and we're still kind of trying to figure that out with only maybe 10 manufacturers. So it seems to me the lack of standardization is kind of due to, I also think if you look at how many legacy pieces of hardware are still in use, like we don't really have any type of regulation on like, hey, maybe your bank shouldn't be running on a 30-year-old core banking server that if somebody turns the wrong light switch off, it just shuts off, right? So it's I think it's easy to forget that we've really only been as a society using the internet and software for maybe 30 years.
Yeah.
And I think, with the whipsaw back and forth for and against regulation, it's also been without demonstrable harm of like people dying in a car accident. It's really hard to get consensus on what that regulation should look like.
Yep. Yeah. And I think one of the things too is that we see this in arguably most industries where there is this transformation to prioritize not just safety and security, but really at the end of the day, it's about quality, where kind of many of the things we've been talking about, parameterized queries, front-end frameworks like React, they're not just appealing because they improve security, but they also lead to higher quality code. And that's the same thing if you look at auto industry or aviation, where at a certain point, the effects of kind of low quality products, if you will, have led to that disastrous results. As you mentioned, it's certainly kind of more tangible when that happens with a car or a plane versus
Yes.
I don't know, server crashing or a data breach. Although I think, for instance, with CrowdStrike, people did start to see the real world effects of even though that wasn't a vulnerability, what a bug in
What is
software
systemically
could
important?
cause.
Because we don't have that
Exactly.
designation like we do in finance, right? In finance, after the financial crisis, we developed this systemically important list of institutions, and
Yep.
we have those systemically important vendors in software and security. They just haven't been identified.
Yep.
Actually, right before you joined to record today, I just told Mike, I was like, you know what? You will never convince capitalism to do the right thing. You have to convince them that it's more profitable to do the thing you want them to do. So I think
Yep.
to your point, it's like a lot of this risk is very theoretical risk or risk avoided, which is really difficult to quantify. But I think we're getting much better now that we have historical numbers of
Yep.
actually quantifying what types of risk we're taking on by not following secure by design.
Yes. And unfortunately, we're going to have to be convinced to end our segment because we're running out of time. But Jack, one of my favorite phrases from a CSRB report was about the Microsoft hack that has the phrase "a cascade of avoidable errors." But I think opposite of that, you've given us a cascade of helpful advice and insights into the secure by design approach. I want to say thank you for that. Also, before we let you leave, we've been asking all of our guests one simple question. Describe Appsec in 3 words, and I'd love to hear what your response is to that.
Yep. So I'll repeat something that I've said a number of times, but really this idea of classes of vulnerability, where I think that's where the future is heading, is like I think there is a future where we just don't have to think about cross-site scriptings or SQL injections. There's certainly some types of vulnerabilities that are going to have a much longer tail and going to be harder to eradicate. But when it comes to some of these, again, relatively basic vulnerabilities, I think it is possible to have a future where we just don't have to worry about them. Whether it's the ones we talked about, or for instance, a future where we are kind of more reliant on memory-safe languages, that we've in large part moved away from languages like C and C++, to languages like Rust. So I think a future like that is possible where for at least the 99% of vulnerabilities that we see out there today, that we can begin to actually see those go down. We can start to think about some of the harder problems in security. So I think it won't be an easy path to get there, but it is possible, and we can get there.
And what are the 3 words that you'd pull out of that, is so we can just remember that?
Vulnerability.
Classes of vulnerability. Gotcha. Hopefully those classes of vulnerability do disappear, but you don't, because I think, as you can tell from my questions, from Jackie's questions, there's a lot more fun we could have with this topic and other things that you've worked on. So we hope to see you back. That'd be wonderful. I want to say thank you to Jackie. I want to say thank you to everyone who's been joined us right now. We do need to take a quick break and return with news of the week.